The air was crisp that October morning, the kind of sharp Midwestern air that carried the smell of dry leaves and earth. Harold McKinney rose before the sun, same as he always had, and poured himself a cup of black coffee in the kitchen that still bore the marks of his late wife's touch-cooked curtains she had sewn, a faint smell of lavender polish on the old oak table. At 71, Harold's days no longer moved with urgency. They were slow, measured, tied to the rhythms of the land he had known since birth. That morning, his concern was simple. The fence on the north pasture had collapsed again. A few stubborn cattle had pushed their way through yesterday evening, and Harold had spent a frustrating half-hour corralling them back. He told himself he would get to it in the morning, and now, with the sun creeping over the horizon, there was no more putting it off. He packed his tools, shovel, post-hole digger, hammer, and a bucket of nails into the back of his battered Ford pickup. The drive out to the pasture was short, but Harold liked the ride. It gave him a chance to watch the fields, to see the golden light slide over the hay bales stacked near the barn. Life out here didn't change much. That was the point. A pasture stretched endlessly, a quilt of dried grasses and rolling hills. The fence line cut through it, sagging in places like tired shoulders. Harold set to work, his joints protesting as he lifted the post-hole digger. He worked with the slow patience of someone who had done this all his life, his breath puffing in white clouds as he dug into the earth. For a while, nothing seemed unusual. The ground was stubborn, hard from weeks without rain. He chipped away, sweat gathering beneath his cap. Then, on the fourth dig, his shovel struck something solid. The sound was different from the dull thud of stone. This was sharper, metallic. Harold stopped, wiping his forehead with the back of his sleeve. He knelt down and scraped the soil away with his gloved hands. A dull gray surface appeared, flat and rigid. His first thought was that it was an old fuel canister. Farmers in the area often buried things when they had no use for them. But the more he dug, the clearer it became. This was no canister. It was a box. Harold brushed more dirt aside until the shape revealed itself, a rectangular metal case. Rusted but intact, its surface scarred with age. He tapped it with his shovel and listened to the hollow echo inside. Something was in there. He hesitated. The land had been in his family for generations. His father and grandfather had worked the same soil, fixed the same fences. What could be buried out here, on property that had never changed hands? He thought of old war relics. Maybe his father had hidden something away after serving overseas. Or maybe it was nothing more than tools forgotten in the ground. But the box felt deliberate, like it was meant to stay hidden. Grunting with effort, Harold pried it loose and dragged it onto the grass. The hinges were stiff, the lid refusing to give. He tried the edge of his shovel, then the claw of his hammer, until finally the rust gave way with a squeal. A lid cracked. Open. Inside, nestled in yellowed paper and cloth, was a pistol. Its metal was dark, pitted with rust, but even in that state, it carried a weight Harold didn't like. It wasn't a hunting rifle, or a farmer's revolver. It was foreign, sleek in its design, built for something colder and protecting cattle. Alongside it, carefully folded into packets, were papers. Their corners were brittle, the ink faded, but the writing was clear. Codes, names, dates. Harold stared. This was no family keepsake. The prairie around him was silent, save for the distant call of a crow. He looked over his shoulder, though no one was there. For the first time in years, Harold felt uneasy on his own land. He slid. The box shut, wrapped it in his jacket, and stood slowly, his knees stiff. The broken fence no longer mattered. Whatever was buried here was bigger than cattle or property lines. Harold had spent a lifetime thinking he knew his land like the back of his hand. But as he walked back to the truck, the weight of the box pressing against his side. One thought kept repeating in his mind. Something was hiding beneath his soil, and it wasn't meant to be found. Harold drove back to the farmhouse with the box wedged in the passenger seat, every bump in the dirt road rattling through the rusted metal. He kept glancing at it, as if expecting the lid to spring open on its own. The pistol had unsettled him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just a gun. It was the way it had been wrapped, protected from time, as though someone had meant for it to last. By the time he reached his driveway, the sun was climbing higher, gilding the barn and the empty clothesline with light. Harold carried the box inside and set it down on the kitchen table, his coffee mug still half full beside it. For a moment, he simply stared at it, his weathered hands resting on the lid. He told himself it was foolish to be nervous. He had found old junk before, farm tools buried in sheds, arrowheads turned up by the plow. But this was different. This had weight, history. And the longer he looked at it, the more it seemed out of place in his quiet Kansas kitchen. Harold pulled out the papers, unfolding them carefully. The pages crackled in protest, fragile as autumn leaves. Some were handwritten, others typed on a machine that looked decades out of date. Most of it was in English, but peppered with strange codes and phrases he didn't understand. Sparrow, Blackthorn, drop point confirmed. It read like instructions, but instructions for what? One paper caught his eye, a list of names, each with a city beside it. Washington, Berlin, Mexico City. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, the names crossed out one by one. He frowned, his mind searching for explanations. It could have been anything: training exercises, fiction, some eccentric's idea of a spy novel. Yet the neatness, the precision, made it feel all too real. He turned back to the pistol. Its grip was wrapped in cracked leather, the metal etched with markings that looked foreign, maybe Cyrillic, maybe something else. Harold had never been a gun enthusiast. He owned a shotgun for the occasional coyote, nothing more. But this weapon was no farm tool. It was built for someone who knew what they were doing. The thought crept into his mind uninvited. Who buried this, and why here? He sat back in his chair, the old wood creaking under his weight. His gaze drifted to the window, where the pasture stretched out, innocent under the morning sun. That land had been his whole life, his inheritance. And yet, under the soil, secrets had been waiting, secrets that didn't belong to him or his family. The unease grew. He imagined someone sneaking onto the property decades ago, digging by lantern light, lowering this box into the earth, then covering it with soil as if burying a body. Who would choose this spot, so far from town, so ordinary? Unless, of course, its very ordinariness made it the perfect hiding place. Harold rubbed his temples. His instincts told him to call someone, but a lifetime of self-reliance tugged against the idea. Farmers solved their own problems. They didn't run to the law for every oddity. Yet the pistol nagged at him. If it was stolen property or tied to something illegal, he didn't want it sitting in his kitchen. The clock on the wall ticked. Past noon. Harold made himself a sandwich, but barely touched it. His appetite was gone. Instead, he found himself reading the papers again, tracing the faded words with his finger. On one page, a name had been written larger than the rest, underlined. Twice, the Falcon. The words sent a chill through him. It didn't sound like a real name. It sounded like a title, something men whispered in bars or soldiers muttered in fear. Whoever the Falcon was, he had mattered enough for someone to write his name in careful ink and bury it with a gun. By mid-afternoon, Harold knew he couldn't keep the box. He wrapped everything in an old feed sack, tied it shut, and carried it back out to his truck. The decision had been made. He wasn't about to let mystery and danger linger in his kitchen. As he drove toward town, the sky stretched wide and blue above him, but Harold felt a weight pressing down. He didn't know what he was about to step into, only that it was bigger than himself. Somewhere deep inside, he understood the truth. Fixing that fence had pulled him into a story far older and darker than his quiet field. The bell above the sheriff's office door gave a tired jingle as Harold pushed it open, the feed sack heavy in his arms. He felt awkward carrying it through town, like everyone could see the weight of the secret inside. A couple of locals on. The sidewalk gave him curious looks, but Harold kept walking, jaw set. Sheriff Linda Graves sat behind her cluttered desk, glasses perched low on her nose as she scrolled through paperwork. She was in her 50s, sharp-eyed, and known for having little patience for nonsense. When Harold stepped in, she glanced. Up, eyebrows raised? "Morning, Harold. Fence trouble again?" she asked, setting her pen aside. Harold shifted the sack onto the desk with a dull thud. "Not exactly," he muttered. "Found something on my land. Thought you should see it." Linda untied the sack, tugging at the knot until the contents spilled onto the blotter. The pistol clattered against the wood, papers fanning out around it. Her expression changed instantly. She didn't choke, didn't smile, she just stared. Slowly, she reached out, lifting the pistol by its grip with 2 fingers. "This isn't yours, I hope," she said flatly. "Never seen it before today," Harold replied. "Dug it up fixing the fence." Linda studied the gun closely, her lips tightening. The markings caught her attention first. "Not American," she murmured. She opened the cylinder, sniffed, then closed it again with a sharp click. Even rusted, it carried a presence that unsettled the room. She set the pistol down carefully, then picked up one of the papers. Her eyes scanned the page, pausing at the underlined word. "The Falcon," she read aloud. She looked at Harold. "What's this supposed to mean?" "I was hoping you could tell me," Harold said, his voice quieter than before. For a long moment, Linda said nothing. She just kept flipping through the paper's lists of names, cryptic codes, dates that stretched back to the early 60s. Each page seemed to drain a little more color from her face. Finally, she exhaled slowly and leaned back in her chair. "This isn't farm junk, Harold," she said. "This is something else entirely." Her tone unsettled him. He had known. Linda for years, seen her break up bar fights and drag drunks off Main Street. She wasn't the type to spook easily. Yet now, with the pistol and papers spread across her desk, she looked uneasy. "What do you mean, something else?" Harold pressed. Linda didn't answer right away. Instead, she picked up the phone on her desk and began to dial, her fingers moving with deliberate care. Harold watched, his unease growing. Whoever she was calling, it wasn't the deputy or the county clerk. She caught his stare and held up her hand. "Sit tight, Harold." The line clicked. Linda lowered her voice, but Harold could still hear fragments. "Yes, it's here. Buried on. Private land, markings match. We'll need a team." She listened, nodded once, then hung up. Turning back to Harold, she folded her hands on the desk. "I need you to listen carefully. Don't talk to anyone about this. Not your neighbors, not your friends, just me." "Why? What the hell did I dig up?" Linda sighed. "Something that's been missing for a long time. Something federal. That gun, those papers, they're tied to a man the Bureau's been chasing ghosts of for decades." Harold blinked. "Federal? You mean like FBI?" Linda didn't answer directly, but her silence was answer enough. She gathered the items into a neat stack and slid them into a folder. Her movements were precise, as though handling evidence from a crime scene. Harold leaned back in his chair, the weight of her words settling on him. He had come in expecting answers, but instead, he felt more lost than ever. The Falcon, whoever that was, had been important enough to send a shiver through his sheriff and bring in outside eyes. Linda glanced at the clock on the wall. "They'll be here soon," she said. "They?" Harold asked. Linda stood, her expression grim. "The ones who've been waiting for this box to show up." The room felt suddenly smaller, the air heavier. Harold's life, once defined by cattle, fences, and quiet routines, had tilted into something he couldn't name. And as he sat there, the reality sank in. By digging up that box, he had unearthed more than a secret. He had stirred ghosts the world had nearly forgotten. By the time the black SUVs rolled down Main Street, the whole town had noticed. Vehicles like that didn't belong in a place where the sheriff's department still drove. Hand-me-down trucks, and the diner's parking lot was the busiest spot in town. Their polished frames reflected the morning sun. Windows darkened like mirrors, leaving no trace of who sat inside. Harold watched from the wooden bench outside the sheriff's office, hands clasped tight in his lap. He hadn't wanted to come back into town, but Linda insisted he stay put. "You started this," she told him. "You'd better see where it goes." The SUVs, parked in a neat line, doors opening in near-perfect unison. Men in dark suits stepped out, their movements crisp, deliberate, no wasted motion. They looked like they had walked straight out of a newsreel, serious, unsmiling, built for authority. Their badges flashed briefly in the sunlight as they approached. "The office." "FBI," Linda muttered, greeting them at the door. Her voice carried a tone Harold had never heard before, half respect, half resentment. The tallest of the group, a man with iron gray hair and sharp cheekbones, stepped forward. "Sheriff Graves. We appreciate your call." His voice was low, steady, but edged with something Harold couldn't quite place: urgency, maybe. Linda motioned toward her office. "It's inside. You'll want to see it for yourselves." Harold followed reluctantly, lingering near the doorway as the agents crowded around Linda's desk. The feed sack was gone. Instead, the pistol and documents lay neatly arranged in evidence bags. One agent slipped on gloves, carefully lifting the pistol. "Cold War issue," he murmured, examining the weapon. He tilted it toward the light, running a thumb across the faint Cyrillic markings etched into the metal. "Russian manufacture, early 60s, modified for silence." Another agent flipped open the folder of papers. His eyes scanned quickly, trained to process faster than Harold could follow. Cody names, drop points, surveillance logs. His voice grew sharper with each page. "Mexico City, Berlin, D.C., these aren't random. These are confirmed operations." Harold felt his stomach knot. He had no idea what confirmed operations meant, but the way the agent said it carried weight. Then the gray-haired man spoke, his eyes narrowing on a single sheet. "This name, the Falcon." He said it as though speaking aloud a ghost. He looked at Linda. "Do you know who that is?" She shook her head. "Only what I saw written." The agent set the paper down carefully, almost reverently. The Falcon was a contract assassin. Not just any gun for hire. He was tied to foreign intelligence networks throughout the Cold War. He carried out operations on 3 continents. Half the files from that era mention him, but we never caught him, never even confirmed his real identity. He glanced at Harold for the first time. Until now. The words sent a shiver through Harold. He had thought he was just fixing a fence. Now, federal agents were standing in front of him, speaking about ghosts and killers, as though they were still alive. Another agent leaned closer to the papers, tapping one with a gloved finger. "These aren't just logs. They're original surveillance notes. That handwriting matches documents we seized in '64 from a safe house in Chicago. Whoever buried this box wasn't just passing through. They had ties." Harold finally found his voice. "So you're telling me? A killer and assassin was out on my land?" The gray-haired agent studied him. "We're saying your land might have been his graveyard or his hiding place. We'll know soon enough." The words hung in the air like smoke. Linda crossed her arms. "What happens now?" The agent didn't hesitate. "Now we secure the site. No one enters, no one leaves. Sheriff, you'll cooperate fully." Linda's jaw tightened. She didn't like being ordered around in her own town, but she gave a short nod. Harold, however, felt his throat dry. "You mean you're going back out there?" The gray-haired agent looked at him with a thin smile, one that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. McKinney, whatever you dug up, it's just the beginning. Men like the Falcon don't vanish without reason. If he was buried out there, something else is waiting beneath that soil." For a moment, the office was silent. Harold's heart pounded in his chest, each beat heavy with dread. He had thought the discovery ended with a gun and some papers. But now, surrounded by federal suits and their cryptic language, he realized the truth. His pasture wasn't just hiding history. It was hiding a crime scene that stretched across decades. And for the first time, Harold wondered if fixing that fence might have been the worst mistake of his life. By the end of the week, the town was buzzing like a kicked-over hornet's nest. Everyone knew something unusual had happened on Harold McKinney's land. The black SUVs parked along Main Street, the sudden presence of men in suits, the sheriffs. Tight-lipped, it all pointed to one conclusion. Something big had been uncovered. And in a town of 2,000, rumors spread faster than prairie fire. At the diner on Maple Street, waitresses leaned close to farmers nursing coffee, whispering half-truths that sounded more like campfire stories. "I heard it was a body," one said, "wrapped in cloth, been down there 50 years. Another swore she'd overheard an agent mention spies, assassins, even the Russians. By the time the lunch rush ended, the tale had grown wild enough to include buried treasure, mobsters, and a plane crash no one remembered. Harold hated it. Every errand into town brought sidelong glances. Some neighbors stopped him outright, asking questions that grew sharper each day. "Harold, what did you really dig up? You hiding something from us? You know they don't send the FBI for old farm tools." He deflected as best he could, repeating the same line. "All I found was a box. Sheriff's handling it." But his voice lacked conviction, and folks could tell. The more he tried to downplay it, the more convinced they became that something darker was hiding under his pasture. The kids at the high school picked it up too. On the football field, they joked about the McKinney farm being cursed ground. A group of boys dared each other to sneak out at night and camp by the fence, hoping to catch a glimpse of government agents digging up more secrets. Teachers had to shut down chatter in classrooms, reminding students that gossip wasn't fact. Still, the whispers kept going. For Harold, the hardest part was the shift in how people looked at him. Some pitied him, as though he'd been caught in a storm too big to stand against. Others eyed him with suspicion, like he'd been keeping a dangerous secret all these years. Even old friends at the VFW grew distant, their conversations turning awkward. At the grocery store, a man Harold had known for decades leaned in close and muttered, "You better be careful, Harold. Folks don't like living next to a graveyard, especially not one with killers in it." Harold wanted to shout that he hadn't asked for any of this, that he'd only been fixing his damn fence. But the words caught in his throat. Maybe they wouldn't believe him anyway. Meanwhile, the federal agents kept their distance, but their presence was constant. Locals spotted them driving the back roads, surveying Harold's land from behind binoculars, setting up strange-looking equipment near the fence line. Their activity only fueled speculation. By Saturday, reporters arrived. They weren't from the local paper, but from Wichita, Topeka, even Kansas City. They crowded the diner, the courthouse steps, the gas station, shoving microphones at anyone willing to talk. What's your take on the discovery? Do you believe an assassin lived here? Has the FBI told you anything? The sheriff did her best to keep them in check, but Linda Graves wasn't built for managing media swarms. She refused to confirm details, and that only made reporters hungrier. Soon, satellite trucks lined the highway, their dishes pointed skyward, ready to beam the mystery of Harold's Field across the country. At night, Harold sat by his window, watching the faint glow of headlights in the distance where the agents worked. He couldn't shake the feeling that his land no longer belonged to him. It had become a stage, and he was the unwilling centerpiece of a story he didn't understand. One evening, his neighbor Martha stopped by with a casserole. She meant well, she always did, but even her voice carried unease. "Harold," she said gently, "they say you found more than a gun. They say you found evidence." She paused, her eyes searching his face. "Tell me it isn't true." Harold tried to smile, but the weight of her words pressed down hard. He couldn't give her the reassurance she wanted, because he didn't know the truth himself. All he knew was that something long buried had clawed its way to the surface, and now his quiet town was unraveling. The unease wasn't just rumor, it was fear, and Harold could feel it settling over the community like a storm cloud, dark and a fog, heavy, ready to break. The morning the agents returned with their equipment, Harold knew something was different. They came in greater numbers this time, 2 SUVs, a van, and a pair of men unloading machines that looked like they belonged on a battlefield rather than a Kansas pasture. The sheriff's cruiser followed close behind, its lights dark, as if Linda Graves already knew there would be no ordinary report filed today. Harold stood by his porch, arms folded tight. He hadn't been invited, but it was still his land, and damned if he was going to let strangers dig without his eyes on them. He climbed into his pickup and rumbled toward the fence line, the same stretch he had mended so many times, now scarred with orange flags marking the agent's earlier scans. One of them carried a device that rolled over the ground like a lawnmower, its screen flickering with colors and lines Harold couldn't read. Another agent tapped at a tablet, nodding silently as patterns emerged. Finally, the gray-haired manned the A. One Harold had come to think of as their leader pointed to a spot a few yards from where Harold had unearthed the box. "Here," he said simply. Shovels struck earth. The sound was steady, methodical like a drumbeat. Dirt piled high as the hole grew deeper, the agents working with quiet determination. Harold watched, his gut twisting with each layer removed. He told himself they'd find nothing, maybe an old root cellar, maybe discarded junk from decades past. Anything but what his mind whispered. Then one of the shovels hit something soft. The rhythm stopped. Silence fell over the pasture, broken only by the wind brushing through dry grass. The agent knelt, brushing away soil with gloved hands. Slowly, a shape emerged, fabric stained dark and stiff with age. "Bag it," the leader ordered. But no one moved. They all knew what they were looking at wasn't just fabric. With deliberate care, they uncovered more. The outline of a body wrapped in oilcloth came into view, curled as if shoved hastily into the earth. The cloth peeled under their touch, revealing bone and fragments of clothing, preserved just enough to confirm what Harold's heart already knew. It was a man. Harold's breath caught in his chest. His land, his family's pasture had been hiding a grave. For decades, cattle had grazed above it. Storms had rolled across it. Children had played tag near that fence line, never knowing what slept just beneath. The agents worked in grim silence, calling out measurements, photographing every angle, marking positions with numbered stakes. A forensic specialist crouched over the remains, his voice calm and clinical. Male, approximately 40 to 50 years old. Single gunshot wound to the skull. likely execution style. Execution. The word landed like a stone in Harold's gut. He turned away, staring out at the horizon, but he couldn't block the sound of the specialist's voice as he continued. Dental condition poor. Evidence of travel wear boots, likely military issue. Hands show calluses consistent with firearms use. This was a professional. The gray-haired agent listened, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his tone heavy with certainty. It's him. It has to be. After all these years? He glanced at the sheriff, then at Harold. You've just found the Falcon. The name carried more weight now, no longer ink on a faded page, but bone and cloth in the Kansas dirt. Harold's knees felt weak. He gripped the fence post beside him, steadying himself against the swirl of nausea and dread. Linda Graves approached quietly, her voice low. You okay? Harold shook his head, unable to answer. He wanted to. Ask 100 questions. Why here? Who killed him? Who buried him? But the words stuck. The agent zipped the remains into a black bag, lifting it carefully, as though even in death, the man carried danger. Cameras clicked. Evidence bags filled. The pasture, once Harold's sanctuary, had transformed into a crime scene. As the vehicles pulled away, carrying the body of a man who had once haunted governments and intelligence files, Harold stood, alone by the half-fixed fence. The grass swayed gently, disguising the scar in the earth. He realized then that the land he had trusted his whole life was no longer the same. It had betrayed him, keeping secrets under its skin. And those secrets had teeth. For days after the body was hauled away, Harold's farm became a revolving door of federal agents, historians, and forensic experts. They moved with quiet urgency, piecing together the fragments of a life that had ended violently under his pasture. To Harold, it felt surreal his land, once defined by the creak of gates and the lowing of cattle, now buzzed with radios, clipboards, and words that belonged to history books, not fence posts. He stayed back most of the time, watching from his porch as strangers combed over the field. Yet part of him wanted answers too. He wanted to know who had turned his soil into a graveyard. It was Sheriff Linda Graves who finally offered him a glimpse. One evening, she drove up his long gravel driveway, dust trailing behind her cruiser. She stepped out, holding a thin folder under her arm. Her face was drawn, the kind of look she wore when the weight of her badge pressed heavier than usual. They've confirmed it, she said without preamble. It was him, the Falcon. Harold swallowed. The name no longer sounded like just a word on old paper. Now it had flesh, bone, and a bullet hole. Who was he? Harold asked quietly. Really? Linda opened the folder, thumbing through copies of old documents. Real name still unknown. But records show he was one of the most effective contract killers during the Cold War. He worked both sides, sometimes with foreign intelligence, sometimes freelance. No loyalty, just jobs. She handed Harold a black and white photograph. It was grainy, taken from a distance, showing a man in a dark overcoat outside what looked like a European train station. The face was partly obscured, but the caption beneath read only, The Falcon, 1961. Harold studied it, unsettled. The man could have been anyone, an ordinary commuter, a neighbor, but the knowledge of what he had done made the image heavier. They think he killed diplomats, Linda continued, double agents, even businessmen who stood in the way of certain governments. Every time someone important dropped dead in the late 50s or early 60s, his name came up in the files. But they never caught him. He disappeared after a job went bad in Mexico City. Harold looked up sharply. And he ended up here. On my land. Linda nodded slowly. Looks that way. The thought made Harold's skin crawl. The Falcon had crossed oceans, toppled lives, and carried out murders under government's noses, only to die in the quiet soil of Kansas, the very place Harold had thought untouched by such darkness. Later that week, the gray-haired agent himself spoke at a press conference on the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed as he addressed the crowd, his voice steady but grim. For decades, the Falcon was a ghost. His work destabilized nations, cost lives, and fueled fear at the height of the Cold War. Today, thanks to the discovery in McKinney County, we have confirmation of his fate. He did not vanish overseas. He died here, in the American heartland. Sometime around 1963, reporters erupted with questions. Who killed him? Why Kansas? What else had he left behind? The agent answered carefully, revealing only pieces. Forensic analysis suggested execution shot at close range, buried hastily. The documents found with him painted a picture of betrayal. Perhaps he had fled after angering the wrong people. Perhaps his own employers had silenced him. Listening from the edge of the crowd, Harold felt a strange chill. He imagined the night it must have happened. A car pulling up in darkness, men dragging a bound figure across the field, the muffled crack of a pistol, the hurried shovels scraping dirt. The Falcon, feared across continents, dying quietly in a Kansas pasture no one would notice. That image haunted him. His fence line had witnessed it all and kept silent for 50 years. Back home, Harold sat on his porch, staring at the horizon. The agents might have pieced together the official story, but questions gnawed at him still. Why here, of all places? Who had chosen his farm as the burial ground? And most troubling of all, had someone in town known? As the crickets chirped and the prairie wind swept across the grass, Harold realized the past wasn't buried so easily. The Falcon's story was now part of his land, part of his life, whether he wanted it or not. The agents were gone within 2 weeks. Their vans rolled down the dirt road in a convoy, carrying away boxes of evidence, bone fragments, and decades of secrets. The pasture, once crowded with strangers in suits, was empty again. Only the trampled grass and a raw scar in the soil remained, marked by stakes and plastic tape that flapped like ghostly flags in the wind. For the first time in days, Harold stood at the edge of the field alone. The silence was deeper now, the kind that pressed against his chest. He'd fixed fences here 100 times, but the land didn't feel like his anymore. It felt like it belonged to history, to the Falcon, to the men who killed him, to the country that had waited half a century for answers. Still, chores waited. The cattle had no interest in assassins or Cold War conspiracies. They needed grazing land, and the fence had to stand. Harold gathered his tools once more: post-hole digger, hammer, nails, cedar posts. His hands worked. Out of habit, though each swing of the hammer echoed strangely in his ears. As he dug the new post hole, his shovel hit dirt instead of secrets this time. But even so, he couldn't shake the memory of the box, the gun, the papers, the body. Every strike of the shovel seemed to ask a question. Why here? Why him? He paused to wipe sweat from his brow, glancing toward the horizon. He remembered the way the gray-haired agent had spoken, how certain he was that Harold's pasture had been chosen for its very ordinariness. No one would suspect a Kansas farm, far from embassies and capitals, to hold the grave of a ghost. When the fence finally stood again, straight and sturdy, Harold rested his hands on the top rail and looked out across the field. He wanted to feel pride, the same quiet satisfaction he'd always felt after a day's work. Instead, he felt something heavier await pressing down from the soil itself, as if the land was reminding him what it had been forced to carry. The townsfolk slowly returned to their routines. Reporters left when the story cooled, chasing fresher headlines. The diner returned to gossiping about weather and football scores. But every so often, someone's eyes lingered on Harold a beat too long. their curiosity unspoken. He could tell the whispers hadn't fully died. At night, Harold sat on his porch, listening to the cicadas. The world looked the same, stars wheeling across the sky, wind tugging at the wheat, coyotes yipping in the distance. But he knew better now. He knew how easily history could hide in plain sight, waiting for some tired old farmer with a broken fence to stumble across it. He thought about the falcon more than he cared to admit. Not just the assassin's crimes, but the way his story had ended. Alone, betrayed, buried in a Kansas field no one would think twice about. Harold wondered if the man had known, in those final moments, that he was being erased. Or if he had fought, clawing at the dirt, desperate to leave behind more than a name in faded ink. Harold picked up a stone from the fence line and turned it over in his palm. Life was strange that way. Some men built, some men destroyed. And sometimes, the destroyers ended up beneath the soil, forgotten until the shovel blade struck them awake. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the fence was whole again. Harold leaned against it, shoulders aching, and let out a long breath. The field stretched quiet before him, but it wasn't the same quiet he had known all his life. It was a quiet that hummed with ghosts, with secrets, with history too dark to name. He knew the grass would grow back, covering the scar. Cattle would graze. Children might run through the field again. The land would heal. But Harold would never walk it without remembering what had been buried there, what had been pulled from the soil like a warning. The fence stood again, marking the boundary of his farm. But to Harold, it marked something else. The place where the past had clawed its way into the present, and where the ghost of an assassin would linger forever beneath the Kansas sky.